So much beautiful music today. It's kind of overwhelming. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. When I was 18, I went away to college to be an art major at a small liberal arts school in the middle of nowhere, Illinois. And I'd always been, to that point, a mostly well-behaved teenager, mildly repressed in the way of Catholic Midwesterners everywhere. But now I was experiencing my first taste of independence, the first tentative steps towards adulthood, and I wanted to do something to highlight that newfound freedom to define myself on my own terms. And I had a desire even to step outside of my self-imposed limits and maybe even deliberately do something a little out of character for myself. So I decided to take up smoking. Now, I knew that smoking was not a great idea in the sense that in the long run it can cause cancer, emphysema, etc., etc. And in the short run, I was a kid with asthma. So this made me a very poor candidate to go to flavor country. So my thinking was, of course, I'm not going to be a smoker. I'm just going to smoke for a bit, and then I'll stop. So fast forward 6 years. I'm sitting in a ready-med with a nebulizer strapped to my face. I have a raging case of pneumonia, terrible case of pneumonia. The doctor has written me out a prescription, which is sort of clutched between my nicotine-stained fingers, and in big bold letters it says, "Stop smoking." Which is good timing because smoking is not on the table right now anyway. It hurts to breathe a lot. And it's going to continue to hurt to breathe for the next several days. So I couldn't inhale a cigarette at that point, even if I had wanted to. But I could light a cigarette, and I could hold it in my hand, and if I put it close to my face, then it almost sort of felt like I was smoking. And in this way, I toughed it out, and I made it through that pneumonia-enforced window of not smoking with my addiction intact. That's commitment. Okay, so flash forward 2 more years. 2 more years. How I hate quitting smoking. I quit, and I quit, and I quit. I buy a pack of cigarettes. I smoke 2. I angrily throw the rest out. I'm done. Never again. The next day, I buy a pack of cigarettes. Tomorrow, I quit for real. I make elaborate strategies. I'll smoke 20 today, 18 tomorrow, 16 the next day, like so. Right, I'm like Bridget Jones logging my cigarette consumption in my diary. 20, 18, 16, 20, 30. Okay, cold turkey then. No more strategy. Just quit, I smoke, I quit, I smoke, I throw them out. I fish them out of the trash. I shred them in little pieces on my kitchen table. I dig change out of the couch cushions and I go to buy some more. It's exhausting. It's like the least fun hobby ever invented. I probably quit smoking 25 times in a 6-month period. That's no joke. Failure after failure after failure. And then on the 26th attempt, I quit, and I quit. Haven't smoked in 17 years since that day. And weirdly enough, it's been easy. After that last time, it was no big deal at all. First it was impossible, and then it was easy. Now, a few weeks ago, I gave a sermon about the nature of the self, and I talked about how in many respects we are black boxes to ourselves, right? We're mysteries to ourselves. And the experience of addiction, of being addicted and trying to quit, really brought that home to me because for that period of time I was a house divided against itself in my own head. There was a me that badly wanted to quit, but there was another me that was working just as hard to keep those smokes coming. And I faced the second self almost as a stranger, trying to figure out what made him tick. How do I get around his defenses? How do I communicate to this person what we're trying to do here so that I could get him on the same page as me? And it wasn't clear ultimately who was going to be running the show in the end. Now what's interesting to me about that experience also is that I have no idea what made the difference between those quitting attempts. 1 through 25, failure. Quitting attempt number 26, success. I have no idea at all why one was a success and one was a failure. By that time, I was plenty afraid that I was never going to be able to quit. And based on all available evidence and my impressive 8-year track record of not quitting, I could certainly have drawn that conclusion. But I would have been wrong. Okay, so addiction is a dramatic example of what I'm talking about. But there are many ways in which we can be divided against ourselves. Right? Everyone's born with a mixed bag of personality traits. Some we find helpful, some less so. There could be patterns of behavior that we find ourselves returning to time and again that we no longer want, but we struggle against. These could be family patterns handed down generation after generation. Or maybe patterns of behavior that served us well in the past, like defense mechanisms that no longer serve us well. Or patterns rooted in our environment that we grew up in. We hear our Father's voice when we talk to our kids, even though we swore we would never talk to our kids that way. We lose yet another day to Facebook when we know that we really ought to be job searching. We put off that project at work to the very last minute, and then when we realize we are in the predicament again, we go, how on earth did I do this again? And when we talked about the self, we talked about how we tell stories about ourselves to understand ourselves. Over the course of our life, we sort of weave a narrative about who we are out of all of our varied experiences. Out of all the things we say and do that we aspire to and succeed at and fail at, want, don't want, wish we didn't want, but we do, and we have to come to some balanced estimation out of all of this of who we are. Who is this person that I am? And sometimes this narrative of who we are can get captured by those recurrent patterns because they're so frustrating and they seem so intractable. And so we start to believe our own bad press. Right? Those patterns that are a part of who we were become our story of who we are. And then they become our story of all that we are and all that we ever can be. But in truth, we are always much vaster than any idea that we think we have about ourselves, about who we are. There's a satirical newspaper called The Onion. Maybe you've heard of it. They publish fake, humorous news stories, right? And there's one story in particular that I've come back to a couple of times. If you've attended a New Year's Eve service, you've heard this before. But the headline of this fake news story is, 97-year-old dies unaware of being violent prodigy. And the article goes, retired post office branch manager Nancy Hollander, 97, died at her home of natural causes Tuesday after spending her life completely unaware that she was one of the most talented musicians of the past century and possessed the untapped ability to become a world-class violin virtuoso. She's survived by 2 daughters, a son, 6 grandchildren, and 3 great-grandchildren, all of whom will forever remain oblivious to the national treasure Hollywood would have become had she just picked up a violin even once. And then the article then details the sort of hauntingly beautiful concerts she would have given and the international accolades she would have received. Except that as it happens, she never did pick up a violin. So instead, she's remembered for her world-famous potato salad that she brought to every church potluck. Now, most of us are probably not undiscovered geniuses. But we are all much bigger than we know. Humans are fabulously rich, complicated, powerful creatures. Each and every one of us has more potential than we could fully explore in 100 lifetimes, let alone in just the one that we're given. And the tragic comedy of it all is that we're not given an operator's manual at birth to tell us how to unlock that potential or how best pursue our own best selves. So we're left to stumble after ourselves as best we can, constructing a sense of who we are out of those bits and pieces, as I said. And if we're fooled into believing our own bad press, the stories that we tell about ourselves can become self-fulfilling prophecies. And instead of illuminating our inner life, they can become self-defeating and they can obscure our potential. In the news article, it's just dumb luck that this woman never picks up a violin even once in her entire life. But imagine instead her as a young woman browsing through a music store. Maybe she's buying some sheet music for her church choir. And she stops in front of the violin section. And she's looking up at the instruments kind of longingly, and her hands kind of tracing out the shape by her side. And before she asks to have one taken down for her, she thinks, you know, you'll never follow through with it. You never follow through with anything. Or she thinks, wouldn't Mom laugh to see me with a violin? Or who am I to spend this much money on myself? Or this is ridiculous, I don't have an artistic bone in my body. Or for heaven's sakes, grow up already. By the time I was 26, about the same time I was quitting smoking, I'd become firmly convinced of a few things about myself, partly as a result of a string of, let's charitably call them non-successes, as a young adult. First as an art school dropout, and then later as a mathematics graduate school dropout. And one of these ideas that I was firmly convinced of was that I was fundamentally missing whatever mysterious power it was that allowed other people to be creative, to create art, or music, or writing, or come up with new ideas in science or math or what have you. I didn't have that creative power. And the other related belief was that I didn't really have anything to say. And I firmly believed those two things at age 26. And with that went a lot of very negative and very hopeless feelings, right? It wasn't a good place to be in. So, what can help us get out of those patterns and help us stop believing our own bad press? What we'd like to have are practices in our life that help us arrive at a reasonable, grounded estimation of who we are, right? We all want self-knowledge and self-understanding. While at the same time reminding us that a larger self exists, and even ideally helping draw us out into that larger self, into that space of possibilities. The first practice I'm going to recommend is something from my own experience, from that experience of being 26. When you feel trapped by your negative patterns, when you're feeling the full weight of your perceived limitations, and you've got that kind of critical monologue in your head, running down all of your failings or your perceived failings, step back a moment if you can from that monologue and picture yourself as the child you once were at some young age, 3, 4, 5. And imagine that that negative, frustrated voice, you're so stupid, you did this again, you're such an idiot. Imagine that that voice is not speaking to the adult you, but that it's speaking to that child, to that 3-year-old. Does that trigger some protective impulses when you imagine using that voice for that child that you once were? And if it doesn't, imagine it's your own child if you're a parent, or the child, even a child that you don't know. Practice extending to yourself the same kindness when you speak to yourself that you would extend to that child. When I was at the low of my low, one thing that helped me was I made what I considered at the time to be a completely arbitrary and pre-rational decision to be nice to myself. Or as I put it to myself then, to be on my own team. I had kind of an epiphany one day sitting in my living room. And I decided, even if all of the negative things that I think about myself are 100% true, even if I am absolutely as terrible as I think that I am, I'm going to root for myself anyway, like a Saints fan from the 70s, right? Even if I have to wear that paper bag doing it, I'm going to root for, I'm going to be Team Jamie. And as part of that, I'm going to be kind to myself. It's hard to be a person. As we talked about in our lottery sermon, we don't get to choose our genetic makeup, the strengths and weaknesses we're born with. We don't get to choose the environment we were born into or the family that we're born into. Evolution did not consult us when it invented the nightmare of adolescence, compared to which butterflies have it so easy. We don't decide if the economy booms or crashes. We just have to play the hand we're dealt with as best as we can through all of life's trials and tribulations. Right? So it's hard to be a person. And that doesn't mean that life is hell, and it doesn't mean that we're helpless, and it doesn't mean that we're not responsible and accountable. It just means that kindness is warranted, and kindness can start with us. And I really see this as extending our first UU principle to ourselves, trusting in our own inherent worth and dignity. And when we extend kindness to ourselves as a practical matter, it's easier to believe in our own possibilities. And the prospect of failure is less daunting, because when we do fail, we can be kinder to ourselves about it. So that's one practice. The next practice is acceptance. Acceptance has been defined as giving up the hope that someday we'll have a better past. And if we're still struggling against the past, if we're still reliving our failures and our regrets, refighting battles in our heads, agonizing over what could have been or should have been, then we're wasting energy that could be spent towards creating a better future. And once we stop struggling against the past or running from the past, it loses some of its charge, and we can evaluate it maybe a little more objectively. Maybe there are some things that we still need to take responsibility for. Maybe there are lessons to be learned that we hadn't noticed before. Or maybe, really, we don't need to ever think of it again. Acceptance doesn't mean we have to like our past, it just means we accept it as a fact so we can move forward. The third practice is simplicity. This can mean different things to different people, but the basic idea is that if our life is crammed full of stuff, that can be material stuff, non-stop activities, non-stop obligations, non-stop distractions, then there's very little room for newness, for growing into a new self. Now, simplicity doesn't mean throwing out all of our items, right? It's really a practice that tries to get at identifying and orienting our lives around the things that are truly important to us. Whether it's family, or creative work, or service, or whatever it is, we build our lives around that, and we let go of some of that lesser stuff. And when we center our lives in our deepest values, we create a deeper, more authentic, more joyful relationship with ourselves and with the people around us. And we can then also better see where our negative behavior patterns, those things that we do again and again that we make ourselves crazy about, we can see where are those things impacting things that are truly important to us, in which case it demands our attention and our energy, or things that are not really that important to us, in which case maybe we can let it go with a little good humor and laugh at ourselves. Everyone's got something, right? I will never, ever return a video on time in my lifetime. I don't know why that is. It seems like I could master this task, but I can't. And you know what? It's not important. Don't let me video, but it's not important. What are you going to do? And the last practice is just to have a spiritual practice. And that can again mean many different things to different people. Coming to UUI every Sunday can be a spiritual practice, although it helps if it's daily or near daily. Other examples are meditation or prayer, yoga or tai chi, gardening, journaling, knitting, painting, cooking. You get the idea. We want to carve out some space for just being quiet with ourselves, for listening to ourselves so we can heal, so we can take stock, and we can remember that we are so much more than today's triumphs and frustrations, so we don't get defined by today's triumphs and frustrations. The last thing I want to talk about today is the role that modern Unitarian Universalism holds for the power of love in personal transformation. And I'm going to give two versions, one for theists and one for non-theists. Okay? You pick the version that you like best. And the theist version of the power of love in personal transformation goes like this. There's a creative, living presence that is immanent in the world. Immanent in the world. We're swimming in it, and its essence is love. It can be, and has been called by many different names, God, Goddess, Spirit of Life, Spirit of Love. But the important thing is it's everywhere, and it's always available to us as a source of strength and healing. And here's the universalist part. We don't have to do anything to earn or deserve that strength and love and healing. We are already loved just as we are, whether we know it or not. And as we open ourselves up to a greater connection with this living force, through worship, through our spiritual practices, through acts of loving kindness, His love will fill us and transform us. In our mysticism service last month, we noted that many people have an experience of that force, a direct experience of a presence, sometimes as an inner feeling, sometimes as a vision. They describe a world radiant with divine power, where every leaf, every blade of grass is shining with exuberant joy of a living being that radiates love. Now, what we are ultimately to make of those visions is for each person to decide for themselves. Now, here's a non-theistic take, second version on the role of love. The work of Unitarian Universalism is the work of creating the kingdom of heaven on earth by doing away with institutions that are built around violence and fear and greed, and by replacing them with compassion and generosity and love. And here's the Universalist part. We can join in that work right now, just as we are. We don't have to become perfect. We don't have to conquer our old patterns. We don't have to fix ourselves. We don't have to atone for our past in any way to do this work. Just as we are, flawed, imperfect, frequently stuck human beings, we can join in the great project of transforming the world through love, through our service, through the gifts we have to share, through simple acts of kindness, through standing up for the oppressed and the abandoned. We do not have to become good enough to be vessels of love. And as we join in this work, the love that flows through us can become the love that transforms us, that renews us, that heals us, and the love that opens us up to the wonderful possibilities of the best that is inside of us. Blessed be, and may it be so. Would you please rise in body or spirit for the closing hymn, number 131 in your gray hymnal, Love Abetus.